The History of Things podcast is brought to you by HistoryNet, publisher of 9 different historical magazines, including the Civil War Times, American History, and Military History. Visit HistoryNet.com to learn more, or follow them on social media by searching for @history_net. Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoy the show.
Are you ready?
What is happening out there, History Things podcast people? Welcome back to the, well, I guess what are we calling this now, Matty B? Is this the August Offensive?
Yes, I think it is an offensive.
I think that's what we've settled with. Obviously, sitting here in the War Department studio with my esteemed, my illustrious, my literally 4 times now published, author here, my co-host with the most. You guys have known him. You've loved him for so long. He's still in the honeymoon phase with him. I mean, I am. I still love this guy. Guys, Matty B is here in the studios. Matty B, how are you real quick before we get into it?
I am good as ever, Pat. It's been a wild July.
You're not kidding.
We are now getting into August, but July was a chore.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, for those out there keeping score, you can't get to August until you go through July. So since we are now in August, Matt and I are both shaking off battle anniversaries. We are shaking off Independence Day holiday celebrations. We are shaking off the fact that it got so bloody hot here.
Yes.
Like mid-August, showed up in early July.
True.
Stupid hot. Matt, by the way, did you sweat into an entirely different person during the battle anniversary this year? Because I felt like I time warped into some different century than the one I live in and the one I work in. Like, I don't know where I went, but I was somewhere.
Well, on Saturday, for sure, it was stupid hot. We did get a little bit of rain on Sunday, which helped break things up a touch. But yes, on Saturday, when we had well over 400 people at the site, and that's just the folks we were able to count.
Remember, the lawyers were serious, Matt. It's the site. You got to stop right there. We had a great celebration. The heat definitely affected it. You could tell people were feeling it almost all the time. So, but if you're interested in that conversation, come and see us at our sites. It should be very obvious where we work at this point, though we won't say it. But
well, we can say for you.
Yeah, I could say it. But come see me at Fort Frederick. But come see Matt at a place in Frederick that happens to be near a Target. We'll just say that. But anyway, come out and talk to us about what we do there. What we really are here for today is the beginning of a second conversation with an absolute Civil War legend. You guys are probably still floating, all you Gettys nerds especially, are probably still floating around on Cloud 9 after our amazing chat with Scott Hartwig, now retired, but chief historian at Gettysburg National Military Park for a very long time. A guy Matt and I grew up with a personal Mount Rushmore, right? He's on. He's got to be on.
Certainly.
It's like him and Ed and like 2 others maybe, but like definitely Scott. And we're just, don't email and ask who the rest of the Mount Rushmore are. I'm not telling you. It's my own personal Mount Rushmore.
Everybody has their own.
You should have your own. Don't base yours off mine. And my opinion doesn't matter to you, whatever, blah, blah, blah. But Scott was here and we fanboyed.
Oh, quite a bit.
Quite a bit, but apparently didn't weird him out. He met us out in the field to continue the conversation. So for all of you who were taking it in, the Gettysburg 160, I don't know. You guys shove it in your face like it's a smorgasbord. You just, I can't, you guys can't get enough of it.
There was a smorgasbord this year. There was so much happening up there with the 160th. And
that's right, you spoke up there. You actually worked in the madness up there.
Only a little bit, but I was happy to be involved. I was happy we were so heavily involved and that we had so many good friends and colleagues to work with up there, be it with addressing Gettysburg and their crew, be it with the Seminary Museum, be it with the National Park Service, the Heritage Center, what have you. We have a lot of friends and colleagues up there that we were able to work with.
When you say it like that, I didn't realize our footprint that day was actually pretty, or that weekend was actually pretty vast. Mm-hmm. Pretty proud of that. So yeah, we for all of you out there who were waiting around for us to cover the Gettysburg story.
We have done so.
We obviously took a long time to get to it, and now we have done so. You got to literally listen to the battle story, the campaign, and everything with Scott Hartwig. We had Cody Aish from the Seminary Museum up there focus on Alexander Hayes. Mm-hmm. And Matt,
that amazing story.
Is it the greatest middle finger of the Civil War?
Probably.
I mean, in my opinion, it is, but like it just has to be. I don't know. But that was an incredible story. So we definitely, and we met up with both of them in the field. So we didn't just meet with Scott. Cody also came out and met with us and let us up into the cupola. That was pretty rad. Listen, I know a lot of you have been there before, but I hadn't been. Right? I don't know if Matt. Don't break my heart, Matt. Matt hadn't been either. Wink, wink. But I hadn't been, and it was such an awesome moment for us. And we got to hang out with two people that are just masters of their craft. And Scott, already legendary. Cody, one day, if you don't know who he is, you're going to feel silly. He didn't get in on the ground level.
Right.
And get to know him when he was just your average Joe, because he's not even that anymore,
I was going to say, he's already blowing up.
But where he's going to be versus where he is right now, this will seem like the slim pickings, because in one day, oh man, one day we'll be talking about Cody like we talk about Scott and like we talk about Ed.
That's true.
And so, so you're going to want to check out those episodes. But we didn't just focus on Gettysburg. So you guys obviously got an incredibly solid episode on the Vicksburg campaign.
Yep.
Also happened, right, Matt?
Yep, absolutely it did.
Not just Gettysburg. And we had Ranger Andrew Miller for that. That was an awesome experience. You can follow him on Instagram. He's down there in the Department of the Trans-Mississippi. He's moving around right now.
He's Western Theater, technically.
Technically, you're right. This is why
Trans-Mississippi is beyond.
Yeah, it's even super further west than where the Western Theater even is.
Right.
I don't know. Dude, I am an amateur in all things of my life. So let's actually move away from amateurs, right? Because this conversation is the final conversation we're going to have on the subject of Gettysburg for a while. We will not come back to it for a while. It's just, as you guys know, it is not where Matt and I like to focus on the Civil War. Not because it's a bad story. It's just A, it's oversaturated, and B, where's our loyalties, Matt?
And the Maryland campaign.
We are Antietam guys. That's right. Maryland campaign for life. If we see you on the streets, Gettys nerds, we might start snapping our fingers, and you know what happens next. Steel cage. The belts go on the line. But we're going to have a conversation now with the legendary Scott Hartwig. He came back a few weeks later after we did the battles conversation, and we focused on the second conversation of the battle, which was memory.
Right.
How did they look at it in the days, weeks, months, years, decades, and how we look at the battle today? It was an incredibly unique conversation, one we were super excited to have. I didn't know what to expect, honestly, because I hadn't focused on how we think about this battle in memory, and just as enlightening as the first one. I mean, there's a reason why he's on the Mount Rushmore, guys. So stick around at the end of that conversation. We'll let you know about some things coming up for this August offensive, as Matt and I are christening it this year. You can't just have a summer blitz. I mean, you're going to wear your troops out. If you look at history, right, blitzes are short and sweet and usually incredibly effective. And we did that in July. We did, 5 episodes in 3 days?
Something like that, yeah.
Remember, Matt, when we did this show and it was like 1 episode a quarter and like maybe a follow-up every other month or something like that? And then we were like, okay, we'll quietly start doing an episode a month. Dude, we just did 3 episodes in 5 days. Not that that's all the time, but, we are cutting-edge technology here. But anyway, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Scott Hartwig and the memory of the Battle of Gettysburg. Scott, thanks for joining us again today, buddy. How are you?
Oh, it's good. Good to be here. Good to be called a legend.
You definitely are, sir.
I do the Wayne's World. We are not worthy. It's mostly out of respect and gratitude. Thank you for your career, because it's allowed me to be inspired and have my own attempted career. So, again,
You've inspired a lot of folks. So.
It would be cool if you did the Alice Cooper thing, and you're like, you're right, you're not worthy. But we are excited to have you back, because obviously Gettysburg is on everybody's minds right now. It's the summer 160th anniversary cycle. When you joined us previously, we went through the actual fighting,
right.
And we kind of condensed it all down into one meaty but digestible episode. And I'm glad we did it that way, because I easily can fall down the rabbit hole, and I realized this once upon a time on a muddy battlefield in France, that we can't get too stuck into things, because our listeners are still stuck all the way back in some other season somewhere. But Scott,
true.
Today we are going to move right into things. We are going to get this army, both armies, off the field and out of town. Obviously, we had the Longstreet's assault. I refuse.
Nicely done.
On brand. Refuse the picket charge. Did I say that last time?
You did.
I refused. Longstreet's assault. There was a lot of people there. They obviously ran into a very well-defended Union position. It failed. They are now moving off the field. What is the scene like? How do you sort of pick it up after the Union Army's chanting Fredericksburg? There's some guys chanting Harper's Ferry. How do you get these armies off the field and out of here?
Well, the first thing I'd say is that we have a tendency, when we look back on these battles, to consider them like, the Kansas City Chiefs just defeated the Philadelphia Eagles in the Super Bowl.
I'm glad you didn't say Giants. We're going to have to end the show right there. I was like, don't say it, Scott, don't say it.
But even though soldiers, there's a lot of emotion in the end of an event like Pickett's Charge. It's a horrific event, and there's a lot of emotion in it. And these Union soldiers were seeing the backs of the Confederates retreating. They were seeing a lot of prisoners being taken, and that energy just comes bursting out of them like Fredericksburg. Just that is a painful memory for these men, and they're shouting it at these men. It's not like, yay, we won the game, we scored 28 points and you got 21, we win the game. It isn't like that, and I don't think most soldiers viewed it like that. I think once
it's payback,
right? Yeah, but once the initial euphoria wore off, victory in war doesn't feel very good.
Yeah, it can't be sweet. You're hurt yourself.
Right. You got dead people everywhere. You're burying your comrades. There's wounded all over the place. Years ago, I wrote an article about the 69th Pennsylvania. It struck horror to us all was the title of it. And, I wrote a little bit about after Pickett's Charge is over, and I'm like, here's a unit that had 50% casualties. They didn't pick up any Confederate battle flags. They got no medals of honor. And I think the reason that they didn't do it is because they were overwhelmed by their casualties. So the survivors are all trying to take care of the guys who are hit, or they're looking for friends who were killed, and consequently, they don't pick up any flags. They don't get any medals of honor, because you only got a medal of honor if you picked up a flag.
Oh.
You didn't get a medal of honor because you did something extraordinary.
Yeah.
I mean, because the thing is, some guys who got flags did things extraordinary. Some guys just walked over and picked them up off the ground. They both got a medal of honor.
Right.
And today, people apply the criteria for winning a Medal of Honor to the Civil War, which you can't do.
Is this related to how they sort of asked for some of the medals back at one point? They were like, we kind of gave out a lot.
No, that became like a Medal of Honor bonanza in the 1880s, where, you could get a bunch of affidavits from people that you knew, and you could write to the Secretary of War and say, look, I'm amazing. I did these amazing things. Here's all these affidavits. I should get a Medal of Honor. And they gave them to some of those guys.
Oprah, you get a medal. You get a medal.
They did. So they eventually, in the 1890s, I forget what year it was, they completely changed the criteria for getting a Medal of Honor, and they stopped doing that. There was an entire regiment that Edwin Stanton gave the Medal of Honor to, a Maine regiment, because they were supposed to muster out.
Oh, I'm glad Parker's not here today.
And they stayed in. He gave them all a Medal of Honor. They did take those Medals of Honor away from those men eventually.
I'm sad Parker's not here. I would have rubbed his nose in that one.
The Medal of Honor, like you were saying, you could apply for it yourself, but I don't think you can today. It has to be.
You can't do it today. Somebody. Okay. like Alonzo Cushing from Gettysburg just was awarded a Medal of Honor a few years ago.
2-3 years ago.
Yeah, and I have really mixed feelings about. Not to say that Cushing didn't do something that deserved a Medal of Honor, but there were a number of people on July 3rd who did things that deserved a Medal of Honor who nobody's advocating for, nobody's saying. And Norman Hall was a phenomenal officer who nobody's ever even heard of. He was a brigade commander, and he didn't get a Medal of Honor. But I don't know that today we need to apply what we think should have happened to the past. That's why I'm a little wary of doling out medals of honor to people from long ago with, particularly sometimes we may not have the clearest evidence, but also we're neglecting other people and we're trying to right the wrongs of the past, but selectively. And I don't know that that's a great idea.
But just from a perspective.
But anyway, I kind of got off the course. But anyway, so on the Confederate side, Lee knew that the battle was over. The offensive battle was over. He'd committed everything he had. Every division that he had been committed. He suffered really substantial losses. He was in enemy territory, so he was having to forage for his supplies. His supplies, by this point in the battle, are beginning to run low. He now has thousands of wounded. He's far away from his base of supply for resupply with ammunition in particular, but also with any sort of medical facilities. So he decides to adopt a defensive posture. He pulls back all of his forces from around Culp's Hill and in the town of Gettysburg during the night of the 3rd, and they entrench along Seminary Ridge, Warfield Ridge, that long ridge west of Gettysburg. And, again, one of the narratives that has evolved over the years, because Lee was an audacious commander. I will never deny that. He was definitely an audacious commander. He was a really excellent general. However, we oftentimes think every time that Lee makes a stand like he does on July the 4th, that it's because of his audacity. And I don't agree with that. I don't agree with it at Antietam. He didn't stay at Antietam September 18th because he was audacious. He stayed at Gettysburg July 4th. He stayed at Antietam September 18th because he has thousands of wounded.
Yep.
Right.
And he has to, and a lot of times we don't consider how incredibly complex it was to develop a plan to gather the wounded who are capable of travel. You have to make that determination. Who are they? Where are they? Consolidate the wounded. Get the transportation that you need assembled to there. Arrange for the escorts who are going to be doing this. All these people have to be coordinating with each other. Then determine how they're going to move, and then you're going to retreat if you're Lee. How are we going to retreat?
Right.
How are we going to collapse this line here? So it's a really complex operation, and the idea that they pulled it all off in a day is actually really good.
Yeah.
So Lee. I think Lee knows after Pickett's charge is over, he's got to retreat. He's got to get back to Virginia, or at least close to Virginia, that he can resupply with ammunition. But I think he may not be completely cognizant yet of how much damage his army has taken.
How could you be at that point?
Right.
Yeah, it's hard. But as they start to move, I think it's going to become clearer to Lee, because in correspondence that he writes to Jefferson Davis during the retreat, he writes to Lee, or to Davis, this was, I think, on July the 4th or July the 5th, 5,000 men from the Army went off the other day.
Like just desert?
Left. Deserted, straggled, left the ranks.
Wandered home.
Wow.
Now, most of those 5,000
Wow.
men are taken prisoner.
Right.
So when you see the figure of 12,227 Confederate POWs, that includes wounded, because they took almost 6,000 wounded. A lot of the prisoners that they did take a lot at the end of Pickett's charge, and they took some in other parts of the battle, but most of the prisoners that the Army of the Potomac takes are taken during the retreat, when the retreat begins and throughout the retreat.
Where they're just like picking them off.
Well, and in some instances, they're taking a lot of POWs, because For one thing, these guys are exhausted. It's just pouring rain. These guys are marching through the mud. Some of them, by this stage of the battle, the rations are running short. They don't have a lot of food. They're exhausted. They've given everything they had. Their units suffered tremendous losses, and some of these guys, they just don't have the gas in the tank anymore, so they fall out on the roadside. They go into somebody's house or go into a barn or whatever, and they get picked up by a Yankee cavalry patrol, and the numbers just escalate. So you think about that, 5,000 men is the size of a small Confederate infantry division. That's a lot of men in one day.
Yeah.
So Lee starts to retreat, leaking men the whole way, but the retreat is very skillfully executed by his army. And
Scott, before we get too far away from Pickett's charge, I apologize.
No, go ahead.
James Longstreet implies that I think it's in Manassas to Appomattox, that he's trying to put some sort of defensive line together at the end of the day of July 3rd. Was there, and obviously Lee pulls back and digs in on the 4th. Was there any real expectation on the Army of Northern Virginia for a federal counterattack? Or were they just being pragmatic?
Was there even a federal plan for a counterattack?
Well, Meade did take a look at trying to make some sort of an attack. But the problem with Meade attempting a counterattack, because that's another one of the myths of Gettysburg, is that, all Meade had to do is like do a Duke of Wellington and go, up guards and at 'em, and, the whole army.
Yeah, exactly.
The army was in a defensive posture. It was not in an offensive posture. And the troops were not placed offensively. And the primary offensive unit that Meade would have had available to him was the 6th Corps, and they were parceled out all across the entire front of the Army. It's going to take the rest of the day to assemble the 6th Corps. Then you have to decide, where are you going to attack him? You don't want to attack him in the center because he's got all of his artillery there. You're going to have to try to attack him on one of his flanks. That's going to require maneuvering. That's not going to happen until the next day. So any sort of maneuvering, major attack, it isn't going to happen until the next day. And I'm not sure an immediate counterattack would have even succeeded by the Army of the Potomac. So in that respect, I think Meade, I give Meade a break there. I don't think that a counterattack would have routed the Army of Northern Virginia. It was too good an army. It was too tough an army to just suddenly rout away at that point. So as far as Longstreet, they were hurt really badly.
Right.
And their center was badly hurt. So Pettigrew's division, half of Pender's division or Trimble's division, and Pickett's division are essentially off the order of battle chart for at least a day or two. I mean, Pickett's division is off the order of battle chart. They use them to guard the Union POWs because the division's been so badly mauled. I mean, it's lost all its leadership except for Pickett. That cuts Lee down to 8 divisions, and each one of his divisions has been badly hurt. But they had enough brigades, Mahone's brigade, Posey's brigade, and the other 2 brigades of Trimble's division. They had enough brigades, that's a division, to more or less plug the gap in the center and whatever stragglers they could get together from the broken brigades, and they made the assault, Longstreet's assault.
Longstreet's assault. Thank you. Thank you. You all heard it here. Scott Hartwig taking cues from me. I'm in the club now. It's official. You can't keep me out.
Anyway,
make room on the couch.
You've made his day.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to live on that one for a while.
Anyway, they, I think that they established a strong enough defensive position that they felt reasonably confident that they could handle an attack by the Federals, particularly if it came in the center. I mean, because they had all that
crossing the same
there.
ground. Yeah.
And by the end of Pickett's charge, they may have brought up some of the reserve ammunition, so some of those batteries would have had some long-range ammunition. They had all their canister left.
Right, exactly.
So I don't. Yeah.
No thanks.
Yeah, I think that I don't think the Confederates thought, oh no, they're not going to attack. I think they thought they might, and we need to be ready for it.
Sure.
So they were ready for any possible contingency. So they, the Confederates are on the move, and then the Union Army of the Potomac, once Meade learns that the Confederates have retreated. I should back up a little bit in that, so why doesn't Meade attack on July the 4th? Well,
his army is exhausted too.
But Lee's in a really good position. So
also that.
The only way you're going to attack Lee is you have to maneuver against Lee. And again, that's going to take time because, he doesn't have a map that he can look at and go, oh, I see where everybody is and exactly what strength they are and position they are and so on. He would have to do reconnaissance to determine that. So he'd use his cavalry, maybe some infantry forces to try to test the waters. My guess is going to be he's going to probably try to move against Lee's right. The Union Army's left is what he would have done. And then when you look at that, then you have to look at, okay, what was the road network like? How are you going to maneuver your troops to get into position there? The road network is not great for an offensive movement against Lee's right flank. Anything you're going to do there is going to be slow, really slow. And that's going to give Lee the time to shift troops to counter any sort of movement that you make. So, and also, you made the point, the Army of the Potomac is exhausted. Meade has lost a lot of his key leaders. Two of the key leaders are Hancock and Reynolds. They're your two guys that if you're going to make offensive action, they're your two best guys. The other corps commanders, even Sedgwick's a really, really competent administrator. He's an extremely cautious commander.
Except for that one time.
Jeez, Pat. That wasn't even his fault.
No.
I just like to bring it up.
No, that really was not his fault.
He's got the most ironic death in the entire war. They can't hit anything. Smack. Oh, jeez.
Yeah. Well, he also has the utter disaster in the West Woods at Antietam, but that wasn't his fault.
Also not his fault,
not his fault. But he, so Meade... I think he does do some offensive stuff. They move the Pennsylvania reserves. They maul a Confederate regiment, take a bunch of prisoners down south of the wheat field. So there is some activity that goes on.
Right, there's like fighting on July 4th.
Oh yeah, there was some fighting and there was some skirmishing, but there was some fighting because as Longstreet was pulling his troops back from their positions, some of the troops didn't get the orders. And then as the Pennsylvania reserves are maneuvering across the wheat field, they saw this opportunity to fall in on the flank of, I think it was a unit from G.T. Anderson's brigade, possibly.
Wow.
And, they pretty much completely mauled the unit. And so there was a little bit of fighting. That's part of the reason why also when you see the Gardner photographs on Rose Hill of all the Confederate dead who are kind of gathered up, well, the Confederate details who were gathering the dead for burial had to boogie to get out of there because Union troops were advancing. So that's why you see these guys set up in rows, prepared for burial. Even in one case, there's some guys from Kershaw's brigade in an open grave. So you're like, that's strange. Why is there an open grave?
I didn't even think. I just assumed that federal guys did all that
No,
work.
because the details are out there have to bug out.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense.
When the orders came in, you had to move and move fast because the Yankees were starting to move.
Yeah, also you're wearing the wrong jersey. Get out of town.
Mm-hmm. So anyway, then once it becomes clear to Meade that the Confederates have retreated, then Meade sends his cavalry in pursuit. And again, I think, one of the narratives that has evolved over the years is that the Meade knew the Confederates were retreating. He knew it. He'd won the battle. They were retreating. Why doesn't he hurl his whole army after them? Well, he didn't know they were retreating because there was also a possibility that what Lee was doing was he was withdrawing to just above Fairfield and he was going to halt at South Mountain.
Right.
And a very defensible position. So if he does that, and you're Meade, you're going to establish a supply depot where? At Gettysburg.
Right.
And you've got a problem in establishing that depot because the Confederates had destroyed the railroad bridge. So you're going to have to bring the supplies up by railroad, then bring them over by wagon. So, but that's where you're going to tell your supply services to start moving your supplies. If Lee is retreating, you're going to set your supply depot up in Frederick. So you need to find out what Lee is up to. And he orders the 6th Corps under Sedgwick to do a reconnaissance. I think it's on the 5th that he does a reconnaissance. And it's like old granny time. I mean, literally, it is so timid that it takes a whole day. He wastes the entire day. And meanwhile, the cavalry is run into the Confederate retreat, captures all these prisoners at Monterey Pass. There's all this confused fighting that's going on up there.
Fascinating little battlefield.
Yeah, and then there's skirmishes between the Confederate cavalry and the Federal cavalry.
What is that, like Waynesboro, PA?
Yeah. A lot of really hard fighting in the days after the battle between the cavalry of the two armies in Maryland. But anyway, I mean, once Meade is finally figured out, oh, they're retreating, he orders his army in pursuit, and then people look at it and go, what is he thinking? Why is he sending his troops all down to Frederick? Because they need ammunition and food.
Yeah, they need stuff.
So
there's some really good roads to use, too.
Yes.
Yep.
So the idea is you're going to march down to Frederick, and then you can use the National Road as one of the roads to get your troops up towards Hagerstown and hopefully catch up with the Confederates. And you're hoping your cavalry is kind of keeping them at bay. Probably the worst thing that Meade could have done would have been to send his infantry directly after the Confederates, because the nature of the roads would have been really terrible. It would have really slowed his men down, his artillery, his wagons, everything like that. And it would have made it so much harder to resupply his troops. Because a lot of these guys, I mean, there's just overwhelming evidence in the Union Army. A lot of men didn't have shoes now. I mean, their shoes have given out in the campaign. Their clothing's all messed up. And they need rations. They need food. I mean, soldiers don't fight without food, and they don't fight without bullets.
Right.
And the Army just expended an extraordinary amount of ammunition in the 3 days at Gettysburg. So that's why Meade moves down there. And then he moves over the mountains. Of course, we all know there's all this torrential rain that falls.
Yes.
There was a Union cavalry detachment that destroys Lee's pontoon bridge that he had assembled, and they didn't leave a good enough guard to protect it. And so Lee's trapped. He entrenches his line in Hagerstown, Falling Waters area. And then the Army of the Potomac comes up, and then there's, sparring and skirmishing and so on. And then finally, Meade, this is probably Meade's worst moment in the campaign, because Meade clearly vacillates when he gets down there as to what he should do.
Is this where he has his council of war?
He has actually several councils of war. And, I think Meade's not going to write about this, but I think Meade is a little suspicious of the counsel of some of his senior commanders.
Okay.
And you got guys like Oliver Otis Howard and Henry Slocum and James Wadsworth, and he doesn't have his two real go-to guys here in Hancock and Reynolds. And I think he's a little wary of some of the offensive advice that he's getting from some of his commanders, and then other commanders they don't want to do anything, right? They don't want to attack.
Right.
And we don't know, but he may have been appraised that the Confederate defenses looked relatively formidable. They couldn't really tell from the distance they were, but they looked relatively formidable. And, like I've told people who are like, well, Meade should have just hurled his army against them there. I'm like, well, Lee was not entrenched at Antietam, right?
Right.
And what happened?
It was blood.
He's entrenched at Hagerstown.
Right.
And if there's one thing that we've learned, if you study the Overland campaign of 1864 at all, is that troops almost never carry an entrenched line.
Right.
I mean, one of the few times they do it is Upton's attack, and then the attack on the Muleshoe. And the reason those succeed is because Upton used kind of innovative tactics to do it. And the other one was they used 20,000 men.
Smashed through the door. Yeah.
And all the Confederate artillery in the Muleshoe left before the attack hit. So I think that ultimately, Meade makes this decision that they're going to make this attack, and then when they're going to make the attack, then they call it off, and then Lee fixes the pontoon bridge, and he gets a ferry up at Hagerstown, Williamsport. And he gets his army across the river and ended the Gettysburg campaign. I mean, at least what we consider the end of the Gettysburg campaign. The armies go down into Virginia, and they continue to campaign and skirmish and everything like that. And there's a lot of movement and activities that go on for a while. I mean,
I just learned about the fighting and maneuvering at Wampum Heights
Yeah, right.
2 or 3 years ago. I'm like, what is this?
I know.
So when do they break off contact from each other? Like, when is the last true, like, this campaign is now, like...
Not really till August.
Wow.
Even in August, I mean, the cavalry of the Army of the Potomac is, I mean, I think it's in August. John Buford writes this great dispatch that he's just physically wiped out.
Yeah.
He just says, I just got nothing left. I am physically completely exhausted. I mean, and he's pissed too because he feels like his men are fighting and working really, really hard, and he's not getting any support from anybody. I think some of that you can say, oh, these guys should have done this, these guys should have done that. Some of that's probably true, but I think the other part of it is by this stage in the campaign, these armies are just worn out. They're just completely worn out. And they're like, you know, an 8-cylinder car going on 3 cylinders.
This is the conversation we have on the opposite side of Antietam. It's like, you know, in the 3 weeks, you know, where McClellan's kind of figuring out and getting his supplies and Lee's kind of doing everything. It's like, it's not just the 3 weeks of this campaign that's on their backs and feet. It's like these guys just fought down and up the Virginia Peninsula all summer, barely breaking off contact. Everybody's like, well, they went back to Washington for 3 days, right? How much rest do you really think? Like, by the time they've had the worst day in American history, like, people are so out of gas on every level, not just like emotionally, physically, but your logistics are dry, everything. So
it is true. But, well, just a second, Matt. No worries. We'll get to you. But
we'll get to you.
The one thing I would say that there's a giant leap forward in the Army of the Potomac between after Antietam and after Gettysburg, in that McClellan does not pursue. Right, there's that little kind of pursuit down to the Shepherdstown, and then they get the bloody nose.
Do I get to publicly disagree with Scott Hartwig on my show? Because the reason I say this is because Matt did a lot of research into the Second Loudon or Second Virginia campaign or whatever. I always get them backwards. Which is it?
No, Loudon Valley campaign or Second Virginia campaign.
McClellan kind of does eventually get moving and has a plan that starts to work right around the time he's getting fired. And I always like to bring that up because on our show, we're big about assigning the criticism as it's due, and we're all good at doing that. But you should also assign the praise when it's due. And we with McClellan, we often forget this, so we accidentally have become McClellan apologists on this show.
Wow.
We're not.
At least defenders.
We're not. But we found ourselves in the relevant conversations being like, at the end of the day, what would you have done? Here's the facts, and he does get moving, right?
Well, I think what I would say
he just doesn't smash him on the 19th.
Is McClellan's movements in Virginia, once he gets going, are competent.
Yeah. Right.
That's what I would say. They're competent. They're competent moves. That man is never, ever going to win the war. Ever.
I believe that.
There is not a chance he is ever going to win the war.
I believe that.
And I say that recognizing that McClellan had definite strengths about him. He definitely did. I mean, nobody inspired the Army like he did. But he wasn't going to win the war. And my criticism of McClellan after Antietam is that he had at his fingertips, he had POWs from every division in Lee's army. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to do some intel here, which is you question the prisoners. What division are you from? Now you have the whole order of battle of the army, which he doesn't have.
Right.
He doesn't have that. The second thing you're going to learn is that the army logistically is in really poor condition. That is gold. That is gold, because when Lee pulls down in the Shenandoah Valley, he is foraging for his supplies.
Right.
Which means don't let him forage.
Yeah.
Crowd him. Yeah. You may not want to fight another battle. So what I see,
keep him busy.
What I see with Meade is that Meade does that. Meade crowds him. His army is hurt way worse than the army was hurt at Antietam. But he crowds him. Now, the supply services, I'm going to say, are better for the Army of the Potomac by July of 1863 than they were in September of 62.
Can you give Joe Hooker some credit for that?
Oh, yeah. Hooker does a lot of amazing stuff.
Is make all of our Gettysburg fans cringe because they're like, why are you talking about McClellan? They're like, don't give credit to Joe Hooker. Chamberlain!
Well, I like that you brought up Joe Hooker, because all the points you were making about intelligence failures post-Antietam get fixed by the development of
That's right.
the Bureau of Military Information. And that's exactly what they're doing. They're going through the POWs. They're figuring out the order of battle. The Colonel Sharp, George Sharp, and his field agents, including one that's operating right out of Frederick, they know the order of battle like nobody's business. They knew that the only thing left was Pickett's division.
That's right.
So
That's right. Yeah, I mean, and Joe Hooker had a fantastic quote when he testified for the Committee on the Conduct of the War. He said, "When I took command of the Army of the Potomac," he was referring to the intelligence gathering of the Army. He says, "We knew as much about the Army in Northern Virginia, as if they had been in China." So I mean, but so what I think happened, and Meade never fell victim to this, even though Meade did slightly overestimate Lee's strength, and
Everybody
federal officers always overestimated the capabilities of the Confederates because the Confederates were really good at maneuvering. I mean, that is true.
Yeah.
They were really good at maneuvering, so they're always afraid of that. But McClellan, I think part of the reason that nobody thinks of, we got all these POWs, why don't we find out what units they belong to?
Sure.
And maybe we can ask them what the strength of their unit is, how their food is. We can look at them and see how ragged they are, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Part of the reason I think that doesn't happen is this happens in all sorts of organizations, not just military organizations, and it happens throughout history, and it will happen into the future. It just happened in 2022 in Ukraine.
Right.
You form an opinion of what you believe is the truth, and you seek out the evidence that supports that. So McClellan honestly believed he was outnumbered. So he sought out the intelligence, and he embraced the intelligence that confirmed that bias, and he discredited and discounted the evidence and intelligence that did not. So you're not going to go and try and find evidence that is going to discredit what the boss wants to hear and believes is true. So I would say McClellan doesn't have an open mind of, I'm an open book, I want to know. I want to know the absolute truth. He's convinced himself, for reasons that I don't completely understand, because he was a railroad man before the war, and how the Confederacy was supposed to assemble all these troops is beyond me. But I mean, I went through all these gyrations. I thought, nah, he can't ever possibly believe that. He's just doing that to try and get reinforcements. And eventually I saw enough evidence. I'm like, no, he believed it. He absolutely believed it.
And Alan Pinkerton, in his memoirs, comments basically what you just said, that he was giving the intelligence that headquarters wanted, particularly on the peninsula and to a lesser extent during the Maryland campaign.
Yeah, so, I don't want to deviate too far.
Right,
Maryland
of course.
campaign, we can talk about that.
People are like, no! Well, then that'll be it. Come back anytime you want. You have a new book coming out, so we'll want to talk Antietam again. So,
anyway, to get back to Gettysburg, once Lee crosses the Potomac River, for the campaign is going to continue, but for what we're talking about, the Gettysburg campaign's over. And I always used to love to talk to people about the ramifications of Gettysburg. I'm like, okay, we think back on this. This is the great Union victory of the war. Lincoln comes, he gives the Gettysburg Address, kind of wraps the whole thing up, makes us understand it. Now it's only a matter of time. The Union's going to win the war, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm like, well, think about this. This great Union victory, both commanding generals after this offer to resign. Actually submit their resignation.
Yeah.
Lee and Meade. So the thing is, it's at the time, everybody was dissatisfied with Gettysburg. Everybody on both sides. They were all dissatisfied. They were like, except for the soldiers in the Army, the Union soldiers were like, wow, we just did an amazing thing. We won against these guys we haven't beaten in how long. Right. And nobody appreciates what we did, and we lost all these men, and they're furious at people at home and everything like that, right? Yeah. And then on the Confederate side, you get, even though they don't have as much freedom of the press as they do in the North, there is some criticism that's creeping in about, hey, we think the losses in Pennsylvania were way higher than anything else we thought. And then, by the way, then we surrendered at Vicksburg. Lee goes on this big foray, and it's a disaster. So
I'm glad you mentioned Vicksburg, just because I always say it's not it may not be the biggest victory of the war because Vicksburg is,
Right.
In my world, sometimes I consider it directly on par. I mean, it opens up everything in the Mississippi.
Absolutely,
and
it does.
And what's great about it all, especially if you're a Union man, is it's all like at the same time.
Yeah.
Like literally, it's like, oh, everybody's coming off the field at Gettysburg, and Grant's like, Vicksburg is mine, guys.
And the
Yeah.
Tullahoma campaign's a success as well.
Yeah, and it's. I mean, I've looked at dozens and dozens of Confederate, like enlisted men. If you look at officers, Confederate officers after the Gettysburg campaign,
Yeah.
if you read enough of them, you'll think the Confederates won the battle. I mean, literally, because these are the most.
If you go there today, you'll think Confederates won the battle.
That's true. But these are the most committed to the cause Confederates in the Army, the officer corps. If you go through the enlisted men, you have 80. 80 men left in your regiment.
Wow.
You've lost everybody else. They're all dead, wounded, or captured. And you hear Vicksburg surrendered. And you gave everything you had to give. You may not give up yet, but man, you're demoralized. You are demoralized. So that's why then you start seeing the Confederates have a huge desertion problem after they get back into Virginia. I
Is
mean,
this where the 5,000 leaving the Army
no,
is?
the 5,000 leave the Army in Pennsylvania.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so I just forgot, I guess, in the context of the dates where we're at.
So they're losing POWs all the way across. They lose a lot of POWs at Falling Waters. A lot of POWs.
So Lee's Army is
taken there.
hemorrhaging people even in retreat.
The campaign cost Lee over 30,000 men.
Holy smokes.
So, he has about 75,000. He loses a little over 30,000 men in the campaign, and I mean it's a catastrophe. The campaign is a catastrophe for the Confederates, and but the thing is Lee through a number of different means gradually rebuilds his army and recovers the army. I mean, they use kind of a carrot and stick. They offer amnesty for anybody who's deserted. Then they start giving furloughs to men, which was a huge morale boost because a lot of these men are like, I'm never going to get home again, and I'm going to die.
When they enlist in the Confederates, so I know in the Federals it's like initially, right, 3 months and then like years and stuff like that. In the Confederacy, it's duration of the war,
duration
right?
of the
Like
war.
for the entirety of this thing, right? Like from day one, it was like if you're signing up, you're in it until it's won
And part of that comes back to the fact that they didn't think it was going to last long.
For sure. But they never, once they realized the war settled in, they never adjusted that?
Well, no, they didn't adjust it. And the other thing you see is in these same letters of these Confederate soldiers is that they had very high hopes for this campaign, that this campaign was going to possibly bring some sort of a peace agreement and an end to the war.
Wow.
So what you can also see is that when you take the sort of losses you did at Gettysburg, and then some of these units took at Chancellorsville or at Fredericksburg and at Sharpsburg and so on, you're like, this is never going to end. I got to get out of here. I mean, so after the Battle of Antietam, Sharpsburg, Lee has a huge crisis of stragglers. Completely different reason why he has all those stragglers. They're not having any food.
Right.
Their clothing is in bad shape. They don't have any food. They're just like, I've had it. I'm done. Nothing left in the tank. I'm out of here. After Gettysburg, it's morale. It is morale, and it is a growing doubt that they're going to win the war in the cause. So they don't. I mean, what drives some of them? There's a great letter from a colonel. I think he was not the 28th North Carolina. He was in Lane's brigade, and I forget his last name now. But his letters were published, and he has this fantastic letter where he was adamantly opposed to secession at the beginning of the war. He did not want to secede. He thought it was madness. But once North Carolina seceded, he offered his services. He becomes a colonel. And then he writes this, to me, it's such a telling sentence to his father. He said, it was a mistake. We should have never started this war. We shouldn't be in this war. But we can't let the Yankees conquer us. So that is a big, to me, for soldiers' reasons that they fight change as the war goes on. And I think for many Confederate soldiers, it's become, I'm not so sure I believe in the cause,
But I can't let you beat me.
but I'm not going to let you dictate the terms to me. I'm going to fight. I'm going to keep fighting. And that's different than if you talk to that soldier in 1861 or maybe part of 1862, they might have told you something differently. Like, I believe in the cause. You know, the Yankees are coming down here. They're going to free our slaves. They're going to, destroy our society, blah, blah, blah,
Right.
But after Gettysburg, we can't let the Yankees whip us. Because if they whip us, they dictate the terms. So I think, that is a motivator for some of these men. And, and then the other, I said there was a carrot at 6, so they offer these furloughs, they're offering amnesty. Then they started shooting guys. That was another thing they started doing. Like deserters, they just started shooting deserters. And you can see all of this in the correspondence between Lee and Davis, how they're trying to handle this morale crisis in the Army. And then, I think it was in September, a big religious revival sweeps through the Army of Northern Virginia. I don't think it's an accident that after Vicksburg and Port Hudson and Gettysburg that you've got this big revival that sweeps across the South.
Well, you got to have faith right now, brothers, because we are losing.
Yeah.
Right.
So I think, and it worked. I mean, all these things worked. I mean, the Army recovered its morale and became, as we know, extremely effective by the time it was fighting at the Wilderness.
Yep.
Morale aside, the Confederacy has been conscripting since 1862. That's when conscription starts in the southern states. But do we see a big uptick in conscription post Gettysburg campaign?
That's a good question. I don't know.
Okay.
Because
It's a fair answer.
I wanted to ask, you might have seen me thinking a minute ago while you were talking, I was wondering from the enlisted ranks after seeing, so many of these battles, big campaigns play out. Like, do you see the replenishment starting to dwindle? Is the recruiting, are you not getting as many reinforcements, rebolstering? It's like, that has to be leaning into the morale. Not only are you getting smacked whether you win or lose and all this stuff, but, there's less people coming to fill this out. And, are they seeing that in any degree in 63? Because I know that they're still able to build the Army out, but they are relying heavily on conscription because not everybody... We won't get into this today, but, I mean, the issue of Southern independence is not cut and dry even across the Confederacy.
Oh, right.
And it's an incredibly conflicted story, but I'm just wondering if they're relying entirely on the confiscation, the conscription stuff at this point, because, I mean...
It's curious to me
What are they
because
seeing?
when we see conscription really begin to take hold in the Federal Army, it's not a morale boost to the Army of the Potomac, at least. A lot of those guys are pissed off.
I mean, New York City goes up in flames.
Well, that's a different story entirely. But a lot of the federal regiments that are getting conscription troops in, they don't like them.
The thing about, there are two different things in a way. If you're talking about the Union Army, James McPherson in Battle Cry Freedom has a really great section there he's writing about the draft. And relatively very few men were actually drafted into the United States Army. Most men go into the Army as substitutes, so people pay the fee.
The $300, that's right.
So, or bounty men.
Right.
So what a lot of communities are doing is they're offering these bounties for soldiers to volunteer so they don't have to do a draft in their community. So it's a way of inducing volunteers. And then you get this sort of stuff where you get these guys setting up, shop near the docks. And, the immigrants are coming in and like, hey, you want a job?
Yeah, the Patty's Lamentation stuff.
I've got a job.
Go fight for Lincoln.
Right.
Welcome.
Well, and then we get some very clever immigrant communities as well, where they're offering me $300, this guy's offering me $400, and these guys can make some money.
Listen, I've seen Gangs of New York. I know how it works. All right, Scorsese taught me everything.
I remember seeing a court martial when I was down at the National Archives one time, and they were going to shoot 3 or 4 guys. Every one of them had 3, 4, 5 aliases.
Wow!
Every one of them.
Wow!
And they had enlisted in numerous units for the bounty, and then they caught him, and then they shot all of them, because the Union Army was also shooting people. Because that's the reason why the veterans, the volunteers in these Union regiments, were so angry at the people who were coming in, because a lot of them were riffraff.
Right.
I mean, they had to have armed guards on these trains and boats when they were bringing the new recruits, because guys were jumping off the boats, jumping off the trains. People were shooting these guys down. It was wild. So what I would say is that I don't know of anyone who's done the sort of statistical study that you need to do to determine how did the Confederate Army recover? Did they really recover? How many conscripts did they bring in? Did they bring in more than they? What were the age of these people? What were they doing to try to get manpower? And then also, how much of a percentage of a unit's strength in, say, a Union infantry regiment, an average Union infantry regiment, was made up of substitutes and bounty men after, like October, November of 1863. So I don't think we know the answer to that. I mean, we've got some anecdotal evidence, but I don't know that anybody's done, because that's really hard type of research to do, because you have to go through.
That's a PhD.
That's
right
got to be
there.
somebody else.
That's a PhD.
Yeah.
But I think it's something that is, that'd be a really interesting topic to look
No, I
into.
want to know the answer. So if you're out there listening, I challenge you, whoever you are, get to it.
I was going to say that's your PhD thesis there,
That's
sir.
a lot of statistical math, and that is not who.
Well, I'll tell you
am.
the other, and this would not be statistical. The other PhD thesis is that one of the great untold stories of the Civil War are everywhere the armies travel, there are thousands of black people with them.
Yes.
Slaves in the Confederate Army and people who were hired as doing all different sorts of jobs in the Union Army. We know nothing about them. But everything we know is kind of a few anecdotes here and there. But when you take all those few anecdotes that you run into, there's a lot of material. And I'll bet you, if you really did the research, you're going to start to find accounts from some of the people who were in these two armies, either as a slave or working in the Union Army, who talk about their experiences. But it's one of the great, because you think about the Confederate Army in Pennsylvania, they had at least 10,000 slaves with the Army that accompanied the Army. And the Union Army probably had at least 5,000, maybe a little bit more than that, who were teamsters, cooks, orderlies, servants, et cetera, with the Army of the Potomac. I think sometimes, if I was an African-American person, I'd be probably far more interested in the USCT, the 54th Massachusetts, the fighting men, the guys who went out there and were fighting for freedom. But the African-American people who are serving with the Army of the Potomac are fighting for freedom.
Right. They're doing what they can at that point.
They're doing what they can at that point, what they're allowed to do at that point. And the slaves with the Army of Northern Virginia don't really have a choice in the matter. And you find all sorts of, evidence both ways. Like I was just looking at a letter that a Confederate soldier wrote. He was in a Benning's brigade, and he wrote that in his regiment. He says, many of our slaves left the regiment in Pennsylvania. They escaped. Now, others talk about how their slaves didn't go anywhere. And it was dangerous to try to leave. It was dangerous. Because the other thing was, even if
the war to keep
if you got away...
Right, where are you going to go? Pennsylvania, not super friendly. Scott, I want to move this conversation into the memory of the battle itself. And I want to kind of ask this question to you in a couple ways. I want to, in the immediate, for the duration of the war, what is the effect of the memory of the battle on the men? What is it in the decades that follow, especially like maybe during monumentation? Obviously, it's huge, and not just establishing its own little history sphere at Gettysburg National Military Park, but it really had an effect on monumentation kind of everywhere. And then how do we look at it today? And why do we forget Vicksburg even happened? Like, why is it all about 3 days in July? And, like, why is this epic thing in the West that's just as critical? Just when we talk about it, it's like, oh, yeah, Vicksburg, that thing.
Well, Gettysburg is hot in July, but it's not as hot as Vicksburg,
No, you're right.
Mississippi.
You're right. I've been there in July. It is brutal.
Also, Gettysburg is near the biggest population centers other than California in the United States of America. So it's easy to get to for a lot of people. And, for a lot of different reasons, we can get into some of them. It became, in the memory of the Civil War, the battle of the war that everybody remembered. And a lot of it had to do with, when you were taking it in middle school or in elementary school, Gettysburg was the turning point of the Civil War. It was always, you always saw
But
that.
it's not. It's Antietam.
Right. But you always, I mean, and the thing is, you're never going to displace Gettysburg. I don't care how many books people write. It's just.
We will one day. We're doing the hard work out here. We will die on this hill.
But anyway, during the war, Lincoln does a lot towards solidifying Gettysburg's place in the memory of the war and during the war, and after the war with the Gettysburg Address. I mean, it's huge. I mean, it's just huge. I mean, there's nothing like it in any other event in the war. There's nothing like the Gettysburg Address. It's just this. It's like the battle is this huge event, kind of a defining event, and the Gettysburg Address is.
It's like its own defining event.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It is its own,
just as big as the battle.
It is its own defining event because it kind of encapsulates, to me, what I would tell visitors when I would talk to them in the cemetery about Lincoln is, I said, Lincoln knew when he uttered those words that half of the North didn't agree with him.
Yeah.
They didn't agree that all men are created equal. They didn't agree that, this was a new birth of freedom. They didn't agree with that. And what Lincoln was really doing was saying, this is what a good leader does, is he was saying, this is who we can be. This is the North Star. This is where we need to go. This is the country that the founding fathers wanted us to be. I'm not saying we are this. I'm saying this is what we need to be. And that's the great thing to me about the Gettysburg Address is that Lincoln is challenging the people of this country to be better than they are.
The more perfect union.
I will never not think of it now as like a WWF style challenge. It's like, you want to talk smack? Hang the belt up here. You want it? Be better than that, bro. No, of course it's not that, but I mean, it's
Well,
like.
Lincoln loved wrestling.
But what's, yeah, I know.
He
That's
was a
why
good
I
wrestler.
at the time. But what I always find ironic, not just in the sense that it's such a short speech when so many other speeches throughout history are very long, but the fact that he straight says the words, like, nobody's going to remember what I say here. And yet, it is the most one of the most iconic speeches in American history. It's probably the most iconic speech in terms of how many people across the board at least know some form of it or recognize that it happened. And it's this thing. So November 1863. Is that the first time we kind of hold this battle aloft very publicly in the North or everywhere? Like even in the South, it has a place.
It's been already held up. I mean, you'll read newspapers right after the battle, Waterloo eclipsed.
Yeah, that's the one.
But it was a huge, huge event. And then if you were a person living in any metropolitan area in the North or the South and you looked at the newspapers, you knew that this was a big one. Because the casualty list, like you could look at some of the New York papers and they have like 2 pages of names of casualties in the battle. So you can tell right from that, this is really, really big, really huge. But then there's so much other news that piles on it. Then you get Vicksburg is surrendered. And then there's everybody in the North is like all excited about that. In the South, they're all bummed out. And then Port Hudson surrenders. And then you got the Tullahoma campaign. So you have all these different things going on in the country. And then, people are people. So it's not just Americans. I think all people ultimately move on from an event. Right. And they start to move on from Gettysburg. And in the country, Gettysburg's going to be kind of forgotten by the time you get to, say, the North Anna River. Mm-hmm. And you've had the Wilderness and Spotsylvania. And I mean, these are just incredibly bloody battles. And then they're fighting in North Anna. And then it's Cold Harbor. And then and then Atlanta, they're going at it, or in the Atlanta camp. It doesn't seem like this thing is ever going to end. And you got the operations on the South Carolina coast and North Carolina coast and down in Louisiana. And it's just a sprawling event. And I think people are focusing on those sorts of things. They're not really focusing on the memory of Gettysburg anymore because the reality is set in that Gettysburg wasn't the turning point of the war.
Right, it was Antietam, obviously.
Well, their argument can also be made that the turning point of the war is when Sheridan smashes Early in the Shenandoah Valley and Sherman captures Atlanta, because that probably pushed Lincoln over the edge of winning the election.
Absolutely it did.
So if Lincoln loses the election, we don't know what's going to happen. You can only speculate. But I mean,
Right.
if McClellan had felt compelled to negotiate an armistice for a little while, Confederates have won. They've won their independence, because
They're validated.
if you get an armistice, they have enough period to recover and fortify themselves, and you're just not going to have the will anymore to win this war, and you're not going to have maybe the personnel to win the war, and so Lincoln's election. So the North still could have lost the war in 1864. They could have lost the war. So that's why I say there is no turning point in the Civil War. There are turning points. So Antietam is a turning point. Gettysburg is a turning point. Atlanta is a turning point.
Monocacy is a turning point.
There you go, yeah. I mean, the Shenandoah Valley is a turning point.
But hosts of this podcast, bear any resemblance. It's merely a coincidence. Whatever the TV thing says, it's whatever.
And then, of course, the Lincoln's reelection is just huge.
Yeah.
That is what kind of puts the nail in the coffin. You're not going to win now. You know that Lincoln is going to be president again. You're just not going to win if you're the Confederacy. You don't have the
math isn't there.
The math isn't there anymore. And I don't know that as a society, the willpower's there. You can find lots of guys in the Army of Northern Virginia who are willing to die to the last man, but they don't represent their whole society.
Well, I mean, that's what I was getting to earlier. Is even from day one, this was a complex issue, and now you've had 3.5 years of arduous blood spilling everywhere, and then it's stress on the home front. And then you have critical back-breaking moments like getting your breadbasket absolutely cleared out and having your main manufacturing city absolutely, annihilated, mostly by your own hand. We'll get into that another day. Wasn't Sherman. He kind of just let it happen. We'll get into that. But you can see that, how if this was a problem in 1861 when things were at their peakest, their best, most inspired, most pumped up, I mean, people's energy have to be incredibly low at this point of the war.
So it's, and then, ultimately, gosh, I lost my train of thought there.
We were just talking about the fact that people have moved on from this. By the time we're actually fighting in the wilderness overland, and by the time we get to Petersburg, and as Sherman starts to move upwards into the Carolinas, and I guess a succinct way to put it is that is a battle that is in the past at this point. It's already happened. There's blood being spilled right now. There's blood going to be spilled tomorrow, and people are very locked in on that.
Yeah, they're focused on. It's the Battle of the Bulge, maybe a turning point in the war in Western Europe. But if you're fighting in Germany in March of 1945, the Battle of the Bulge is history. Right, and you're worrying about what's going on right now, and we got to take this village, and there's guys with Panzerfausts and machine guns, and so that's your immediate worry. And so Gettysburg, it's just a huge battle in the memory of the war as the war ends. And what is going to start to change how we remember Gettysburg is, I don't think you can point the finger at one man, but if I had to point at one man...
Is it Uncle Dan?
Nope. It is John Batchelder.
Okay, good.
It's John Batchelder. John Batchelder...
I feel like the shallow end was Dan, and I was like, don't do that. Don't do that.
John Batchelder is a artist. He's a photographer as well. He lives in New Hampshire, and he has always been interested in military things. And he wanted to write a really, really detailed history of the Battle of Bunker Hill. And one of the things that he learned when he started on writing his history of the Battle of Bunker Hill is nobody had ever interviewed any of the guys who fought there for the most part. So there was almost no reliable information, personal information about the battle. So he had decided he had some physical problems, so he never went into the Army. But he did accompany the Army of the Potomac in the Peninsula Campaign, and he did a lot of really cool artwork in that campaign. He was a very good artist. And he gets sick, and then he has to leave the Army. And when he leaves the Army, he says to his buddies who are officers in the Army, he's like, hey, if any big campaign or battle comes up, let me know. Let me know, because I want to document it. So when he learns about the Battle of Gettysburg, while the battle is going on, he gets in a train, and he heads down to Pennsylvania, and he arrives on the battlefield, I believe on July the 5th. 1863. So there's still dead guys on the battlefield. They're burying the dead and stuff like that. The photographers are at work on the field. And he spends over 70 days on the battlefield sketching the field and interviewing wounded soldiers, Union and Confederate, who were in the battle. And that's how he's going to place his units, because he's doing these sketch maps and things like that, and you can show them to, like, a guy from the 11th Mississippi or whatever he might be talking to, and, like, do you remember this, and so on. So that's how he, and then in the fall of 1863, he finishes, it's a commercial project, this isometric map of the Battle of Gettysburg, which is a bird's eye view of the battle. He goes down to Brandy Station, to the Army of the Potomac headquarters, and he shows George Gordon Meade what he's been working on. Meade's like,
Sweet, dude.
wow, that is amazing. I mean, why are you doing this? Literally, he's amazed that somebody has an interest in doing something like this, right?
Right.
In documenting this battle. But anyway, so Meade and all of his corps commanders endorse the map. It was a commercial venture.
Wow.
You could never do that today. They all endorsed the map. So the map is a big seller. So this is 1863. When the war ends, Batchelder has never lost his interest at Gettysburg. He thinks Gettysburg is the key battle of the war. He thinks it's the key battle of the war.
He's the first Getty's nerd.
And he wants to document it. So in 1869, he assembles a group of over 150 officers. I think 5 of them were Confederate. The Confederates were very suspicious of Batchelder, because they were like, he's a Yankee. We think all he wants to do is, like,
Make money.
gloat over the victory and use us as props. And anyway, but he gets 5 Confederates to come. And then the thing that they do is they don't just all sit around and, tell war stories, is they go out on the battlefield and they mark positions. So the first day they go out, there's this stenographer with them who's recording what everybody's saying. They have the transcript of it in the library at the National Park, at Gettysburg National
incredible.
Military Park. And the first day, it's really great stuff. But there will be like, we marched, 225 yards north of the McPherson barn and drove in a stake for the 150th Pennsylvania, the left flank, and then so they're marking the positions. I don't know if they did the flanks, but they marked the positions of the regiments. And by the second day, you could tell the stenographer was like, wow, I can't keep up with this.
I am exhausted.
So then all the stenographer would go is, drove in a stake at blah, 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 drove in a stake at blah, blah. But anyway, he did, one of the things that was kind of interesting is when they got to the wheat field, one of the Confederates was William Wofford, who's a brigade commander in McLaws' division. And Wofford makes this statement that the guy wrote down. He says, I saw more men killed with the bayonet here than any other place in the war. So people jumped on that. They're like, oh, my God, everybody was bayoneting each other down here. Well, there was well-documented bayonet fighting down there. But the thing was, it's possible, like, if 5 guys got bayoneted, that was the most Wofford ever saw in the war.
Sure.
So,
If you've never seen it and one guy gets bayoneted.
yeah, so it was kind of rare, but anyway, so they have all these officers together. They're relaying all this stuff. They're marking all these positions on the field. It's also the time when Batchelder probably meets with Walter Harrison, who was on Pickett's staff, and they are sitting in the shade of the copse of trees, like eating lunch or something like that, while they were riding around on the battlefield. And while they're sitting there, Harrison goes, by the way, these trees were the landmark that we used to guide the assault column. And Batchelder was like, really?
So that's where the copse of trees comes from.
So he's like, oh my God. He says this reverence for this copse of trees. And then I think it might have even been the same year Basil Biggs, he's a legendary guy in the Gettysburg area, this African-American guy who lived west of the battlefield, and the Confederates used his farm as a field hospital. He obviously fled when the Confederate Army came into the area. But he was he worked the Underground Railroad, he was a veterinarian, he was a farmer, he was just kind of like and he was tough as nails. The other thing about him is he was on the team of men who did all the reburials. So all those guys in the National Cemetery, Basil Biggs and his crew did the physical work. Samuel Weaver was the supervisor, but Basil Biggs and his guys did the physical work. So Biggs bought the property that included the copse of trees. And Batchelder comes riding along one day, and Biggs is out there
Cutting the trees down. Oh, no.
And I guess they'd gotten big enough that maybe he was going to use firewood. We don't know what he was going to do. But anyway, Batchelder starts talking to Biggs, and he's like, hey, the historical importance of these trees and blah, 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 blah. And Biggs was a really practical guy, and Biggs, we don't know what he said to him, but presumably he said, I need the money, man.
Yeah.
You want to buy
I
them?
know, and it's a big, but this is my land. And so Batchelder finally goes, these trees are going to be worth a lot more money to you if you leave them standing than if you cut them. Biggs goes, okay. So he stopped cutting. He left the trees. They bought the land. The Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association, which was this organization that was created in the fall of 1863 to preserve the site of the great Union victory. So the interesting thing about the GBMA is that the monument, the memorial, was the battlefield. Their original idea was, we're not going to do anything. We're just leaving the battlefield the way it is. And they could only afford to buy some little places, but they did buy the copse of trees. They bought a part of Culp's Hill. They bought East Cemetery Hill. They bought a little chunk of Little Round Top. So because all of these places had physical evidence of the battle at that point. You've got lunettes, breastworks, etc., bullet-riddled trees, and so on. And making a long story short here, Batchelder continues to have all of these different officers coming to Gettysburg and going over the battlefield with him. And he's building this reputation. Ultimately, you can read it in the Batchelder papers. There's all these letters that people wrote as endorsements for him, like George Meade, Henry Slocum, on and on. Batchelder knows more about the Battle of Gettysburg than anyone alive. These are the guys who fought the battle and managed the battle, and they believe Batchelder knows more about the battle than they do. So that's a testament to how much Batchelder knew about the battle and his interest in the battle. And the other thing that he does is, when they held this reunion of all these officers in 1869, they held it at the Springs Hotel, which is at the site now defunct of the old Gettysburg Country Club, which is now inside the park boundary. It was the old Harmon farm. And the Springs Hotel, the idea there was this catalysine spring that was there, and the waters from the catalysine spring were healing. Oh. And this was going to become the Saratoga of Pennsylvania. You come here to heal yourself, for rest and recuperation, and be a good investment for the investors, right? Everybody's going to make money on this thing. And you got history, right? Yeah. So you have history. And they created this trolley that ran from in Gettysburg, so you could take the train to Gettysburg, get on the trolley, and ride the trolley out to Springs Hotel, drink the special water from Catalysine Spring. Anyway, Batchelder writes a tour guide for visiting Gettysburg. He's encouraging tourism. And this is going to come out in 1873, 2, something like that. So it's really early. So he's encouraging, he's going to write a couple of them, 2 or 3 of them.
The first double-decker bus showed up in 1872.
So he's writing these tour guides to encourage tourism to Gettysburg. And then, you start getting veterans now. That's 20-some years after the war. They're getting close towards the 25th anniversary, and some of these vets are beginning to think of, we would like to put a monument up, like to commemorate what we did. And Gettysburg was also Everybody knew it was the big battle. It was a big victory. But the other thing about it was the GBMA owned some land there. So if you were a veterans group and you wanted to, hold a meeting of all your vets, and they do these encampments. They love to do these encampments. Gettysburg was a great place to go meet because you had rail transportation there, and you had a place you could do your encampment. And the other thing was the GBMA, starting in 1879, changed leadership. So there was a group of veterans led by a veteran named John Vanderslice. He was not in the Battle of Gettysburg, but he was in the Army of the Potomac. And Vanderslice orchestrated a takeover of the GBMA. He got all these GAR posts across the state of Pennsylvania to vote out the board of directors and vote in a new board of directors. And the new board of directors included all Union veterans, and also included on the board was going to be John Batchelder. And John Batchelder was brought on as the superintendent of monuments, tablets, and legends. So he's going to be the guy who's going to decide where monuments go, what monuments get placed, what do they say, et cetera. He has to vet all of that sort of stuff. But Vanderslice actively encourages veterans to come to Gettysburg and erect monuments to mark where they were. And the other thing they decide to do is they deviate from what the original GBMA wanted to do, and they're like, we are going to start opening avenues up that follow the line of battle of the Army, the Union Army, the Potomac. So Hancock Avenue, Slocum Avenue, these avenues just weren't willy-nilly, that would be a cool place to put an avenue. They're like, that follows the front line of the 2nd Corps, the 12th Corps, the 11th Corps, the 5th Corps, the 3rd Corps, and so on. So the avenues follow the line of battle of the Army. And then it provides access for vets when they come back to see where they were on the battlefield. They can erect their monuments in these places. They can go see their monument, etc. So starting in the 1880s, you start getting an increasing number of veterans who are like, yeah, we'd like to put a monument up at Gettysburg. So and then by 1888, it becomes really, really big because that's the 25th anniversary.
Right.
And in fact, it gets controversial because it's all about memory. So then you've got, one of the cases for the 72nd Pennsylvania Monument went all the way to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court.
Oh, and, I've heard about that.
So it got really contentious in some of this stuff. And so, but the other thing that was interesting is that when you look at Gettysburg and you see where all the monuments are, and there seems like this order to everything, right? There's kind of like a plan. But Gettysburg is not Central Park. There's not a master plan. There's not somebody who sat down and said, oh, this is what we're going to do here. Gettysburg evolves over the years. It just gradually is evolving. Oh, we could do this if we did such. So, for example, the 15th, 19th, 20th Massachusetts erect monuments. I think it was 1887. And they placed their monuments all at the copse of trees because all three of those regiments advanced to the copse of trees during the repulsive pickets charge and drove the Confederates out of the trees and then drove on down to the angle. They placed all their monuments right there. Now, that's not where they were in the general line of battle. They moved to that position. Batchelder approved all those monuments. But after he approved them, Batchelder was like,
didn't like that move.
You know what? There was 20 regiments that moved up there. And if we let everybody put their monuments there, this is going to be a mess. This is going to be a jumble. Nobody's going to be able to figure it out.
A lot of concrete, a lot of marble.
Well, years from now, people are going to be like, where was everybody? How did they all end up here? So he goes down to this is the area. He meets with the Secretary of War and all these officers of the War Department. And he's like, here's my problem, how do you think we should handle this at Gettysburg? And they all finally come to this conclusion. They're like, what you need to do is you determine where they were in the general line of battle of the Army for the significant part of the battle that they're in. That's where their monument goes. Then, after they've placed that, if they can afford it and they want to, they can place an advanced position marker.
Small one.
So he got all three of those regiments to agree to move their monuments to where they were in the line of battle. And that meant for the 19th Massachusetts, they were in the second line. So they went into the second where they were in the reserve position. Then they placed a tablet where their monuments were that says the regiment advanced to this point. So that's what, and you can go around the battlefield and you say, oh man, Batchelor didn't do that here and he did that here. Well, I mean, placing these things can be kind of gray sometimes. It wasn't always cut and dry. Like particularly down in the second day's battlefield where the 5th and the 3rd Corps are fighting and the 2nd Corps, the guys are all kind of jumbled in there. But overall, Batchelor did an unbelievable job in marking the field and settling a lot of these disputes that these people were having. But the other thing that Batchelor, and he's also encouraging this tourism to Gettysburg. So you're building this memory amongst people of Gettysburg is this big moment in American history. And then he builds the High Watermark Monument.
Is Steinway Avenue his fault?
No. Well, you could say it is because it's a outgrowth of tourism.
I can't even keep a straight face as I do that. But yeah, think about it. It is the tourism hub. It is the Disney, and he's here promoting it. He's the first. It's his fault.
Well, how does Gettysburg town feel about all of this and the bringing in the tourism and all of the veterans and things like that? Are they for it right away?
It's going to force them to grow at this point.
I think the town. I'm sure you had some sourpusses who didn't like it, but it brought a lot of tourism dollars into the town. I think they liked it. I think they liked it. It was exciting. There was a lot of exciting things. Frederick Douglass came to Gettysburg and spoke. There was a lot of Ulysses S. Grant came to Gettysburg. So in the late 19th century, it's attracting a lot of public attention because you've got all these vets coming back, the field's being marked, you've got railroad transportation. It's a really cool place for people to come and kind of remember the Civil War, and particularly for the Union veterans. So this is leading to... So we still have GBMA is operating what is the Gettysburg battlefield, and they're through the years they're acquiring more land. So by 1895 they have about 540 acres, I think, of battlefield property. But anyway, Batchelor again, he's not the only one. There's others who see this. They're like, there was another army here, and we don't have any of their land. So, and we can't do it under the charter that the GBMA has created in the state of Pennsylvania because that is to commemorate the Union victory. And that gave them the legal authority to go to court. Like if they offered somebody had their property for sale and they're like, we'll offer you such and such, that person couldn't go, oh, yeah, you're the GBMA, I'm doubling the price. They could take you to court over that. And they could get the fair market value. They couldn't do that on the Confederate side of the field. So what they needed was a national park. So Batchelor starts this letter campaign. He's writing to hundreds of Union veterans. How would you feel if we brought the Confederate lines and marked the Confederate lines? And the consensus typically was mark their positions, not one word about their cause. Right, that was kind of the consensus.
Yeah, they were still pissed about this.
Yeah.
Well, they didn't want to glorify their cause in any way. They were fine with marking the positions and listing their losses and things.
That's what I meant.
Things like that. Yeah. So Batchelor starts lobbying, and he gets some pretty heavy hitters: Joshua Chamberlain, Oliver Otis Howard, other people like that who are still alive, lobbying for him to lobby their representatives to get legislation introduced to create a national park. That's where Dan Sickles comes in because Sickles, Big Dan is the guy who introduces the legislation that gets passed in 1895, and the park is created.
He's like, I know how this works. I've been in this club before.
Yes.
That's going to lead to the 5 original national military parks.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So he.
They're outdoor.
Well, actually, the other,
design, right?
some of the other parks are created before Gettysburg. Vicksburg is created before Gettysburg.
Antietam starts the process
Nothing
before
happened
Gettysburg,
before
too.
Gettysburg. Why have we not figured this out? 2 episodes
Well,
into this.
so the thing was, there was an interest in the country to preserve and commemorate these Civil War battlefields and to protect them.
Is Gettysburg the definitive one nationally, like in the national consciousness of the United States by the monumentation era of the 1880s? Is Gettysburg the battle?
Today it is, but
But I mean, in the 1880s. wasn't
no,
the battle.
Vicksburg.
Vicksburg. Is
Vicksburg
still,
was the equal.
okay.
Chickamauga was the equal.
Yep.
It was the big three really were Vicksburg, Chickamauga, and Gettysburg. They were the big three. Shiloh was also pretty important in there as well. And then Antietam, but Antietam is a different model because Antietam, they're not trying to buy up all the land, they're just buying rights of way.
Yes, the Antietam Plan, as it was known.
Yeah, a horrible plan. But,
Indeed.
but anyway, so you know, and one of the ironies is that Batchelder is named to the original commission that is formed to mark the positions of the two armies, and he dies. So he dies in 1894. So he doesn't see it become a national military park, but he probably more than anyone else had more to do with it becoming a national military park than anybody alive, and nobody knows who he is today.
Without John Batchelder, would we be stuck in this world where Matt and I think it personally exists, where we're both annoyed at how often we have to talk about Gettysburg, but extremely grateful for the. Like, recently I said to Matt, I said, I don't think I'm ever going to be critical of another historical film ever again, because recently I like to do in my personal time the coverage of the RMS Titanic sinking, and I just have been watching in some of these forums and things, like Titanic fans are obnoxious. Like, they're so critical, and they crap all over the movies, especially the one from the 90s. And and I think somebody said it, and I was like, wow, what a point. The guy said, some guy commented, said is basically all three of these movies did their job because you're here. Like, let it go. And I was like, cool. So, like, without blah, blah, blah. So coming back to Batchelder, without Batchelder's like influence, like, would we even care today the way that we do? Where Matt and I are both like, I'm tired of hearing about this battle. Everybody's obsessed with it, but grateful people are because they come to the rest of the war after the fact. Like, is John Batchelder, without him, are we even stuck in this modern Getty's nerd swamp?
Yeah, I think without Batchelder, Gettysburg's still going to be a biggie. It's going to be really important. But I don't think it's going to be as big as it is because it's the combination of what Batchelder does. It's not just the documentation of what happened during the battle and marking the positions of everybody. It's the way he markets Gettysburg. So he markets Gettysburg, and he was good at it. He was good, and he lobbies for it constantly with, not just with Union veterans, but also with Confederate veterans. He just wears the Confederates down, and eventually
that's how you got to do it.
Yeah, eventually, these Confederates are like. There's a great letter in 1869 from James Kemper. Basically, Kemper's like, you know what, you're a Yankee. And you probably don't want to hear the truth, so I don't really have anything to say to you, et cetera, et cetera. To 15 years later, I am delighted to talk to you, to come meet with you.
Wow.
I mean, so and then he's writing all this stuff about what happened, and then, I mean, there's some phenomenal letters in there from Joseph Kershaw. So because I think what happened with the Confederate veterans is those who got to know Batchelder realize that he really, truly just wanted to know what had happened. He didn't want to bring in any ideology to the table. He was interested in where were you and what did you do and how did you fight. And I don't want to talk about why you fought. So you can criticize that all you want with Batchelder, but the end result is he got the Confederates to come in and really, really participate in the creation of the park. But one of the things that happens with the Confederate side of the field is that people are like, oh, the Yankees, they didn't want any Confederate monuments here. I'm like, no, that is not why there aren't Confederate monuments. It is that the policy that Batchelder created for the Union veterans applied to the Confederates. So if you're a Confederate soldier, let's say you were in the 4th Alabama Infantry, and you wanted to put a monument up, it's going to go up on Warfield Bridge, where your attack began. That's where you were in line of battle. Now you can put an advanced position marker up after that. So the vets are like, I have no interest in that. And there is a monument. I mentioned that regiment.
Were they being sore losers?
Because there is a monument to the 4th Alabama that was paid for out of the pocket of William Robbins, who was their major, who was a commissioner on the national park. Great guy, really interesting guy. He couldn't get any interest amongst the vets in his unit. And the reason was, you want to put your monument up where you lost your people. So for the Union Army, the defensive positions that they were in is where they generally did their fighting and lost their people. So it wasn't as big a deal for them as it was for the Confederates.
Right.
But there was another reason why the Confederates, by the time the Confederate side of the field is coming into even the realm of possibility of erecting a monument. So it's after 1895. Because they had a little bit of a delay because in the American way, there was a land syndicate that bought up the land along Seminary Ridge.
Yeah.
Because they knew the government was going to try and buy the land and shot the prices way up. And then there was a big legal battle with the land syndicate.
Yeah.
America.
To enable it, but we all think, everybody was like, so on board with this thing, right? Anyway, so they did eventually get the land, but here was the thing: when Confederate veterans started coming back to the battlefield, the government, at government expense, erected tablets to every Confederate brigade, every battery, every division, every corps in the Army of Northern Virginia, and marked their positions.
Are these the famous War Department tablets?
They're the War Department tablets.
Yeah.
So if you're a Confederate veteran, you come back, you look at these things, you're like, man, they already did it. They've already marked their position.
And they wrote about it.
They wrote
Right.
about it.
Yeah, it's not even here we are. It's here we are, and here's what we were about to go do.
They told what we did.
Yeah.
So there was one letter in Confederate veteran from a Confederate veteran who was writing in because there was a lot of criticism about Gettysburg. It was just a big Yankee thing, and the guy's like, "Hey, man, I was just there, and it's pretty amazing."
Yeah.
I mean, it's pretty amazing. They tell the story of the battle, and so that's what brings the Confederates into Gettysburg, and now we have a national military park, and it's got access, and we've got the Gettysburg Address, and then you have all these other events that continue to solidify Gettysburg in our memory. The 25th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. They bring veterans from the whole war in. The 50th anniversary, I mean, that's 50,000 veterans who were in all different theaters of the war come to Gettysburg again. Then you have the 75th anniversary.
When is the photo over the wall taken? 50th?
50th, I think.
The photo over the walls of the 50th, right.
I've heard.
And there's also one at the 75th as well.
But the famous one I think we're all thinking of when I mention it in mind. I've
Yeah.
heard that none of those guys fought at the battle.
That's probably true.
Western theater guys.
It's probably true. It's probably true that they didn't. I mean, the really great hands over the wall story that is not well known took place in 1887. The Philadelphia Brigade was going to dedicate the monuments to the 69th and the 71st and 106th Pennsylvania. This is in 1887, July 1887, and some of the planners of this said, we should invite the veterans of Pickett's division, because there was a picket camp or something like that down in Virginia. We should invite those veterans to participate. And it was a big battle. They're like, no, we don't want any of those Rebs up here. And then they go back and forth. And finally, the guys who wanted to invite won. So they sent an invitation. And the Confederates they had the same battle. They're like, just a damn Yankee trick.
Yeah.
They just want to come up and
They
gloat.
want to do it again.
Gloat and blah, 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 blah. But ultimately, 150 veterans of Pickett's division came to that event.
Oh.
And so on July 3rd, 1887, they did a tour of the battlefield, a carriage tour of the battlefield. And when they came up towards the copse of trees, they stopped the carriages, and all the vets from the 69th Pennsylvania, they all had these white pith helmets on because it was hot out to keep the sun off. And they all filed over into their position. And their monument was there, and their company markers, and they all stood there. And then the Confederates went out into the field and came up like they did during the actual attack.
That's
and when they
cool.
got up there, they put their hands over the wall, and everybody shook hands over the wall.
I've never heard that story.
It wasn't staged. In fact, somebody took a photograph of it. They probably had the guys say, "Hey, that's a really cool picture. Can you guys do that again?"
Right.
Anyway, but they shake hands over the wall, and it was a really genuine moment. These guys who actually fought each other in the battle, shaking hands there at the wall. So there was a handshake that takes place before the kind of staged handshake in 1913 and then in 1938. But when you put all these things together, and then in 1918 you had the Army Tank Corps Training Center was set up on the
Camp Cole.
Gettysburg Battlefield, Camp Colt. All of these big events just kind of solidify Gettysburg in the memory of America. We just remember it. And I think the reason that they do the 50th, this big 50th anniversary occurs at Gettysburg, and it's not at Vicksburg, it's easier to get to.
Sure.
It's easier to get to, and it is near more of the population of the country than Vicksburg is. So it wasn't because, we want to slight Vicksburg or we want to slight Chickamauga. It was that Gettysburg is easier to get to, and also it's a victory. I mean, Vicksburg's a big victory too, but Gettysburg is this big victory, and you have the Gettysburg Address that you can always bring in and recite.
Yeah.
So I think it's not just one thing, it's a combination of things that kind of solidifies Gettysburg's place in our memory. And it's like I wrote some essay a while ago about the high water mark at Gettysburg, and I was writing about the high water mark monument. And I always find it amusing because there's always some really good historians who are going to come along and are going to be like, Gettysburg wasn't the turning point of the war. Yeah, it was Antietam. It's not the high water mark. And I'm like, you know what? You're never going to displace it, man. I'm sorry. That monument right there, people walk out, they walk over, they look at the monument. Oh, yeah, this is the high water mark of the Civil War. It just, it's like, it's a lot of factors that all come together and make it what it is today. And today, it's clear to me from all the people that I dealt with over the years is that when people think of the Civil War, they think of Gettysburg. Now, unless it's somebody who does some reading, like for a hobby about the Civil War, then they may like go to Antietam and Gettysburg and Harper's Ferry and Monocacy and some of these other places that are nearby when they come back. But for the average family or something, that's the Civil War.
And I'm glad you mentioned that, Scott, because you'd mentioned earlier how we learn about the Civil War in 4th grade or 5th grade or whatever, and Gettysburg's always one of the big things that we learn on it. It really does seem, especially as I was coming up through Park Service during the 150th era, that they leaned into that big time with Gettysburg, and that's why the new Visitor Center, which we can't call new anymore because it's been there a while.
Yeah, I know.
Why it does cover the whole war, because Gettysburg's the point where everybody goes.
It's also a destination now, so if it might be your only Civil War battlefield you ever get to.
That's exactly my point.
So
that's exactly my point.
But the thing is, the interesting thing is, because my career kind of spanned this whole thing, is that how we interpreted Gettysburg changed dramatically. So when I came to Gettysburg, it was a celebration of Confederate courage. Yes, the Union Army won the battle, but it was the high water mark. The high water mark was kind of the theme, and the high water mark was, look at the courage of these Confederate soldiers who crossed this mile-wide open field and made this attack, and it was this, this tremendous courage. They almost carried the day, but they were defeated. And then, you also have all these memes that are constantly running around where the Yankees had overwhelming numbers and the Confederates were overwhelmed by the numbers and the industry and everything like that. And over time, and the other thing was, we interpreted what existed in the boundaries of the park. So we didn't talk about the town of Gettysburg. I mean, we might talk about some of the people who lived on the battlefield, but we didn't talk about the town of Gettysburg. We didn't talk about things that took place outside of what we actually controlled. And starting in the 1990s, a big turning point at Gettysburg when I was there was when the superintendent, John Latcher, arrived. And John Latcher was he was the best superintendent Gettysburg's ever had. He was a trained historian. He was a combat veteran from Vietnam. He'd been a colonel in the Army Reserve, so he had military training. He was a PhD in history, so he had all these really great skills that he brought to Gettysburg. And he got the Organization of American Historians and some other historical groups to really start to take an interest in the battlefield, and they started commenting about, how we were interpreting the battlefield. And we, on the staff, already at that point, I was the supervisory historian, so I was in charge of the interpretive program. And I was already trying to broaden our interpretive program. But as you guys who are both interpreters know, you don't snap your fingers and suddenly broaden the interpretive program.
No, you don't.
Isn't that the truth?
You have to have the right people to do it. They have to have the training and experience and be able to do it. And you have to be careful about how you introduce certain things. You do it gradually, and you build the program over time. But ultimately, we started to do that, and then Latcher was always very big on, we used to talk about this all the time, is that a visitor could come, and they did. I remember this one time there was these 2 visitors from England, and they'd done everything. They'd done a tour of the battlefield. They'd gone on the electric map, seen the cyclorama. They'd done everything. And I was standing out at the angle, and they looked at me and they're like, what was this all about?
Yeah.
And I was like, bingo.
Yep.
That is our problem. We tell you where everybody moved and the general's decisions and stuff, but we dance completely away from why they were fighting this battle. And that was one of Latcher's really, really big things. So when Latcher is able to put together this whole gigantic project to tear down the cyclorama and visitor center, restore the cyclorama painting, and build a new visitor center, we spent years planning the museum, what was going to go in there. And one of the key things about that museum was this is a place that many people, this is going to be the only introduction or knowledge they have of the Civil War. And we want them to understand why there was a war, what the war resolved and didn't resolve, and the bigger picture of the war, along with telling them the whole story of the Gettysburg campaign and the battle.
Right.
So that's why the museum turned out the way it did. Is for
the
that
only
reason.
thing I miss was just the endless display of muskets and cannons. When I was a kid, I was like, "Oh my God!" Because you could walk in, you walk up that thing and around. And I like every time I want to see it. And I'm like, when you mentioned the vaults earlier, I was like, I know they're in there still. I know they got them all. But I do love I know there's a lot of criticism from people that, quite frankly, I think if you're criticizing the new visitor center, you're an airhead at this point. But the new visitor center was amazing the first time I saw it, because
It absolutely is.
I personally, and we won't get into it because we're also getting to the end of the show here, is I think that one of the problems we've had in the way we have to talk about this in the delicate way in our modern society is because we have gotten away from the why. For so long, we focused on the buttons, the jean wool they're wearing, the muskets they shoot, all this material culture that isn't the why.
Right.
And it's so fundamentally anti who we are as people. People are a why. We want to know why things happen.
Right.
We want to know why this, and it's like, not this moment. We don't want to know about it in this moment. We don't want to know. We want to know why they. We want to know why they do obliques. Why do you do an oblique on the battlefield, right? We don't want to know why all of this effort was made, why this secession was happening. So I'm a fan of it because all the blood. I mean, all the blood. There's a why behind it.
It's
soapbox. Put away.
It's true because. And for many, many years in my career, the Park Service deliberately avoided talking about what the war was about. Because, I remember on our student education programs, we would stand out there and the Rangers would tell people, well, there's a lot of reasons why the war came. It was slavery. It was the tariff. It was states' rights.
It was the slavery.
And I'm like,
the slavery.
When you start to actually study history of the era, you're like, all of those can be consolidated into one thing.
And was it slavery? Was it slavery, Scott?
And the tariff was insignificant.
Red herring. Complete red herring.
You can look through, you can read through the congressional record in the period right before the Civil War. No one is talking about the tariff. Like every once in a blue moon, a tariff kind of comes up a little bit. The only thing they fight about slavery.
Don't say it, Scott. It's inconvenient. Don't say it. There's people
So anyway,
put my fingers in my ears.
It's also, some of this stuff is the. Now I think we addressed it honestly, but appropriately.
Yeah.
Because the other thing is, you don't need to bang people over their heads with this stuff.
Sure.
And there's a tendency for people to do that because for so long it was the other way around.
Yeah, the pendulum effect. It's swinging.
And I remember I would do a Pickett's Charge walk, and it was a 2-hour program. We'd mainly focus on the troops that were fighting and everything. But what I would always do is at a certain point I started doing this, and it always went over well. We get halfway across the field, and I say, okay, we got to stop here for a moment. We have to talk about why are these men crossing this field to try to kill those men, and why are those men going to defend that position and try to kill these men? Why are they doing this? And then we would talk for a few minutes about what was the war about? What were the causes of the war? Where were we at this point in the war? And then I'd say, okay, let's move on. I'm sure I had people on that program who had strong opinions about things, but it was the way you said it. I didn't attack anybody. I'm like, we just want to address facts, right? And look at this. And what it did was it helped kind of, okay, all right, there's something more than just General Pickett and the maneuvering of the troops across the field and the uniforms and the weapons. And they were doing this for a reason. There's a lot more to this. And it always went over well. Now, we had a lot of people who got super upset about the museum because the museum was pretty clear that slavery was the cause of the Civil War.
I'm not even going to make jokes about it anymore.
Well, I mean, the thing that was
kind
kind of sad and tragic about it is that I also did notice that our minority population visiting the park, and we didn't do any sort of surveys, but eyeballing it absolutely increased. Absolutely increased. Because the story was more
inclusive
for everybody. And it was interesting to me. I'm like, such a visceral reaction from people who they don't want my great grandfather fought for slavery. And I'm like, people talk to me about that before, and I'm like, listen, man, you don't own the decisions your great-grandfather made, because if you'd been in his situation, in his shoes, you'd have fought for it too.
We tell people...
You want to think you wouldn't, but you would have, because of the environment that you grew up in.
Right.
We are super real for this. Let's actually wind this down on this, because I want to openly invite you back. I know we're all busy and we're heading into the summer, but I want to have you back because I want to keep talking more about this in life. But also I kind of want to just talk to you about your career, like just as an interpreter. I'm fascinated by first of all, two questions. When you asked that question, stopping in the middle of Pickett's charge, how long did it take for them on average to kind of get right to it? Like, why are they killing? Why are they killing? I feel like people would be like, well, because they positioned. And how long did it take for people to figure out what you're really asking?
We weren't out there for more than 10 minutes at that.
And people would kind of figure it out right away.
You could get it. You could get to that. You become skilled enough. You can get right to the point really, really quickly.
Yep. Yeah.
So you can say, why did the 11 states secede from the Union? What did they say? And then, so why is Joe Blow, Confederate soldier, standing out here marching across the field? Well, maybe he didn't necessarily agree with everything in there, but his society he comes from, he feels under threat, so he's going to go fight. And maybe on the Union side, the guy was like, I just think the uniform looks cool. That's why I want to go into the Army. And then his buddy gets whacked next to him at Second Manassas, and then another buddy gets whacked at Antietam, and then he starts going, why am I out here?
Yeah.
And then he starts thinking why he's there. So people start evolving their thinking of why they're fighting in this war and, why the war is important. So, I mean, it's a matter of being honest and not accusatory of people like you today. You're part of the problem. You're part. No, it's like, look, let's look at what the sources tell us and just try to have a. I had a ranger. He wanted to do a campfire program about the Confederate battle flag, and Raffiandonian, and it was fantastic. I mean, what he did was it was a kind of a discussion that he got going with the group. So he would talk about the history of how the flag had been used, how it was used in the war, then how it had been used after the war. And then he kind of got people just talking about it. But he was so good at the way he did it. He was able to take this incredibly controversial subject and get people to talk rationally about it and not get all upset.
Well, yet you do not reach people by starting a fight.
No.
And that's I'm a hypocrite. And there's a ton of people out there that know me. They're like, really, Pat? Really, dude? Really?
You do
Especially some people that I work with right now. They're like, really, dude? It's been a hot 2023 already. That's all I'm saying. But I think we'll wind it down on, and what we're touching on, this is a perfect way to wrap this all up, is we're dealing with something that's, Matt and I didn't invent this term, but we're big fans of it. It's emotional heritage.
Yeah,
Nobody wants to be told that their great-grand person was a part of something terrible, directly or indirectly, and I respect that. And it's taken me a long time as a storyteller and interpreter to not be aggressive because I make no bones about it. I'm a Union man. I think and with an armchair quarterback and rose-colored glasses, I would have always fought for the Union. But to touch on what you said a moment ago, I'm from Montgomery County, Maryland, and today Montgomery County is an incredibly liberal, blue Democrat county in Maryland. Like you're getting nothing conservative done in Maryland in that part of Maryland. During the Civil War, it was entirely a Confederate county. They sent all of their sons into Virginia.
Right.
People were like, why is there even a monument here? And that was my first clue that we've gotten so far away from all of this is like, you're mad there's a monument there, fine, but like you don't even know why it was there.
Right.
Because our sons generations ago
That's
crossed the river to go fight in Confederate ranks. And it's tough because I have Confederate ancestry and I'm aware that they were fighting for things that I don't agree with today, but it is what it is. Would I have joined the Confederacy today? No. I'm going to just say it. But in 1861, from Montgomery County, Maryland, probably a 99% chance I'm in the Confederate ranks because even if I don't necessarily believe it,
all your buddies are
Matty
going.
B just joined up, and Matt's my boy, and I'm going to go. I can't let this ding dong go into battle without me. He's going to get killed.
That's right.
So
I'd get killed.
It's messy when we talk about this because we're also not generationally that far removed from it yet.
Yeah.
To this end, I work at a site in Maryland that the guy that lived there during the American Civil War, his great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren are visiting my site still.
Audio error.
Talk about something else for... like you wrote a book about Antietam. Do you ever feel like did you, on the field, you were like, I want to do something else for a minute, just like for a minute?
Well, that was the reason I stayed at Gettysburg for my whole career, is that you could talk about other things at Gettysburg. Because Gettysburg was because for a lot of visitors, that was their only...
Mecca of the Civil War.
It was their only introduction to the Civil War, and you could broaden their horizon. So what your goal was as an interpreter is not to tell them about all these other things, the Emancipation Proclamation and the Siege of Petersburg, et cetera. Your goal was to make them want to go learn about those, because this is a really deep, complicated, and super interesting subject. And this is one of the it's one of the reasons why, one of the things I never forgot is after September 11th, there were all these people just wandering over the battlefield, everywhere, all over the place. Just wandering around. And I was like, what is going on here? And what I came to the conclusion, and I don't know if I'm right, but I think I am, is that these people were there because they were scared. They didn't know what was going to happen. And this was this great test of this country, and we got through it.
Yeah.
So, like, Gettysburg represented that to them. And, I mean, one of the things that happened to me is I had 2 different programs. I had people, I didn't know who they were because they wrote me afterwards. They were both in the Twin Towers on September 11th and got out.
Jesus.
They came to Gettysburg. Because I think there's something about Gettysburg in the American psyche that we find reassuring, comforting. We can hear the words of Lincoln. It kind of reminds us, man, this is who we can be. And Gettysburg also reminds us of this was this great test, and we survived it. So I think that that is some of the power of Gettysburg as well. It's part of the reason why, I was like, where am I going to go that you can teach history like this to this number of people who are interested, and they just want to soak it up. They're so interested. Once you start telling the stories of people and you bring it alive, they just want to hear it, and they thirst for more, and that's when they're going to end up going to other parks.
Well, I can sit in this room and I can definitively tell you, mission accomplished. Job
Most
well done.
definitely.
Because whereas we are now out doing this work, at one point we were just young guys trying to figure this all out, and we were looking to you, inspiring, planting these seeds, posing these questions, and it took me to Antietam, it took me to, Appomattox, it took me around the world. It's even taken me into other subjects. Like I will lend you with the thanks, and then I got to ask you directly, if we look up to you, if we learn from you, who's your Scott Hartwig?
Wow. A lot of different people. My E.B. Long was my professor at Wyoming.
Yeah.
And he was great. He was such a fantastic guy. But I had a lot of different I guess also reading is such a great segue into learning and developing a voice. One of my friends, he died a number of years ago, Greg Coco. He was a phenomenal interpreter, and he taught me a lot about interpreting and connecting with people. But I had a great professor at University of Wyoming, Myron Sutton, who was an NPS veteran, and then he taught some courses that I took about the NPS and about interpretation. So it was just a variety of.
I always like to know because we have a Mount Rushmore of our own. You're not a big guy, but you got your own Mount Rushmores, and I'm always curious. It's I grew up listening to Pantera, who societally probably has no place in modern society now. But when I was learning, Dimebag Darrell's guitar styles, I was like, I wanted to know where he'd learned how to play his way, and that took me back to. Weirdly, bands like Kiss, and I'm like, how did you play so well? And Kiss sucked, and I love Kiss, whatever. But anyway, just, I kind of want to know that for you. But thank you, man, not only for coming and being with us today and in our last episode, but thank you for just finding your passion in this industry and being able to create enough waves that it reached us.
Yeah,
I would say in some weirdly direct way, this podcast exists because people like you did the jobs and the work you did. So thank you.
Thanks.
And please come back anytime you'd like. We got another book you got coming out, a long-awaited follow-up. Finally get to the battle now. And then I want to just pick your brain as an interpreter. Since I'm in that line and that's in that line, it would be great to talk about.
Fun.
So
I think so.
Thank you for coming by.
Happy to do it.
For those who are getting impatient about what's coming ahead, I don't understand how you could have gotten impatient. Scott Hartwig was on our show. What the hell is wrong with you? Just stick around, stay tuned. We got a bunch of important messages coming up.
That was a treat. I don't know what else to say about it. That was an absolute treat. Matt, do you ever just stop fanboying over the fact that we had Scott Hartwig in the studio twice?
Well, it's definitely one of those things where you can't take for granted. Scott is, as you put, a master in his craft. Always a pleasure to listen to. And the amount of detail and thought that he puts into his presentations each time is something special. So having beyond just looking at the battle, but looking at the memory of the battle and the campaign, I thought was very introspective.
I enjoyed how the evolution of the memory occurred. A lot of the really vivid accounts seem to manifest, much later than the event itself. We had accounts from the 80s and the 1880s and the 1890s that are today still some of the most, I guess, primary, sourced, what are cited, I guess is what I'm looking for here. Yeah. Referenced accounts of the battle, and yet some of them are 20 and 30 years after the event.
Right.
And they're super accurate. Some of them are written a day or two later, and they're all over the map. It was it was wild to see that. And you know what? That was kind of a theme even back in the Cody Aish's episode on Alexander Hayes. Remember, at one point, I'm going to speak hyperbolically just because I can't recall off the top of my head, but at one point, let's just say there was 15 or so different perspectives of what occurred. And if you read, there's 11 different accounts among those 15. It's how many different versions of this one event occurred? And it's interesting to have seen that on a much grander scale through time where, people that all took part in this horrible 3-day fight in Pennsylvania, and how they remembered it, going through the weeks, months, years, and decades, things like that. And also how things like the civil rights movement of the 1960s dramatically affected that conversation and how it dramatically affected the visual landscape at the battlefield, which I'll be very honest, actually kind of broke my heart even more. Considering the struggle in and of itself, just what it was. It was a horrible tragedy for this country. But then understanding why the park was initially created. I know we kind of vacillated in the from the field on commemoration, celebration. I think we settled that it was commemoration of the Union victory.
Right.
But it's really this sub-conversation of when the civil rights movement began in the 1960s, there was this visceral response to it, against it, in the traditional Old South, especially. But what happened was there was this visual response of the Confederate battle flag made a dramatic resurgence nationally. And at Gettysburg, you could see that because once upon a time, Confederate battle flags were not allowed in the monumentation era.
Right. The original Battlefield Commission had some very strict rules in regarding monumentation, and that's not just Confederate monumentation either. There was some pretty significant rules in regards to federal monumentation as well.
That's right. Hence why the Virginia Monument at Gettysburg today has a Virginia state flag.
Right.
Even though that's not the flag they were fighting under at that time. But what was interesting was just to see how this sub-conversation in terms of, like, we're focused for the sake of this podcast on the battle conversation, right? But the national conversation about civil rights and the con and the pro and the con aspect of all that, how it played into Gettysburg, because it's the 1960s where you start to see Confederate monuments start to reflect the imagery of the flag and things like that. And I found that interesting and kind of just, disheartening in a
unfortunate.
Yeah, in a it happened before I could ever be a part of it. It's just like it's a weird lament, right? It's like, man, we did that. Like when we brought up the conversation of equality, we were like, what we think about that? The old way. And like it's like, God, and it's like at Gettysburg at one point they kind of try. I don't know if the original focus was to keep that away. I know the original focus was to focus on the Union victory there. But it was kind of nice that in focusing on the Union victory, we didn't have to spend a lot of time looking at imagery that's hurtful to people.
Right.
And it was sad to see that the 1960s really brought a lot of that forth. And I know there's a lot of you out there right now that are absolutely fucking seething listening to me. And quite frankly, I don't care. Ask yourself why you're mad. Like, truly, ask yourself why you're mad. Ask yourself what information's available to you to engage in this conversation, and then ask yourself again why you're mad. But, end of the soapbox, but I just found that was interesting, just that there was such grander conversations than just the battle that found their way into the conversation of memory of the battle.
Right.
And as you said, right, Scott is an artist, just wove it all together. You know me, I don't shut up on my own show. And I found myself just sitting like a child next to Papa by the fireplace. Tell me your stories, Papa. And man, I was into it. That was such a treat. And I hope you all are still enjoying that conversation. And I hope you come back and revisit this one as you think about the Battle of Gettysburg going forward. Maybe it's something that maybe we just created a tradition for them, Matt. Maybe our listeners now every year are going to come back to this moment with Scott Hartwig and reflect. You're welcome. No, we're very grateful that not only Scott came and sat with us, but that you all have stuck around and listened to it, because as you know, Matt and I, we think we're a lot of things, but one thing we both agree is that we are not Scott Hartwig, and we are not as legendary as that guy. So if you can't take it from him, who the hell can you take it from?
True.
But anyway, we got a lot coming up here. So for the History Things podcast, we have the rest of the August offensive. We're going to check back in with Melissa Wynn at some point. We're going to get back to Vicksburg, talk about Grant and Rollins, but mostly Rollins, as you remember my stupidity in her main episode. So we're going to talk about their relationship through the lens of the Vicksburg campaign. At some point, you will see an announcement through social media, but we're going to be doing a fun one that I'm going to pull my storyteller card. I'll flash it to the audience right now. Remember, we said once a year, Matt and I and Parker reserve the right to say we want to be the storyteller. I'm doing it. Boop! I'm hitting the button. Sometime in August, you're going to get a fun one from me. I've been working on something behind the scenes. I kind of teased some of it to Matty B, so he's going to sit here silently shocked, but he knows a little bit about what's up. Matt, just be real. Yeah. He knows. He just did a little hand gesture. That was cute. That was cute. Arr. So anyway, we have some of that coming up. So that will be a neat way to sort of do a lot of stuff during the summer going forward. We'll have a July Blitz and we'll have an August offensive for all of you military campaign jargon nerds. But then we have a major episode next month, though, when we get back into just the monthly things. Eric Money. Mm-hmm. My God, Money. What's funny is we recorded this episode well over a year ago.
Yep.
By the time it comes out, I think we recorded it probably a year and a half before its air date. A lot has changed in all of the worlds, and yet we were so masterful with that recording, you will never be able to tell. We saw the future, we planned for some things, and it was awesome. And if you don't know who Eric Money is formerly the producer of the Addressing Gettysburg podcast. He is one of Matt and ours very, very good friends. He is one of the most insightful and tender and loving people you'll ever meet, but you will never know that if you just look at his grumpy ass face. But he's probably the best resource I have ever personally engaged with on the subject of the Pennsylvania experience of the American Civil War, specifically the Pennsylvania Reserves.
Right.
So for all you Keystone State nerds, you're going to want to tune in on September 1st because Eric Money, I actually don't know if it's September 1st. I always say this and then I'm like, wait, what's the nearest Monday? It's the Monday closest to September 1st where this is going to come out, by the way. But we are going to have Eric in the studio for a juggernaut show. You haven't had one of these 4-hour monsters in a while? Well, guess what? It's Monster Energy Drink time, and we're going to talk about the Pennsylvania Reserves with one of the best storytellers you honestly didn't even know was out there. Is it a 4-hour juggernaut?
No, it's...
Oh, you're giving me the date?
Yeah.
Is it crosses the Potomac date?
It is crosses the Potomac date. It's
Yeah.
Labor Day, too.
Oh, is it? We're not allowed to work on Labor Day, Matt. Isn't that the whole purpose
Well,
of Labor
that's
Day?
why we're dropping this for 'em.
That's right. We're recording it now, so we don't have to work on Labor Day. So there you go. Labor Day Monday. Lee crosses the Potomac and begins the worst game of FAFO he's going to have until 1863. For all you out there, around, find out. So that's pretty cool. So look for that on Monday, September 4th. But I kid you not. Bring popcorn, bring survival skills because it's going to be a while. It's a big episode, and if you are familiar with where Matt usually takes the brunt of the shelling here on this show, your boy Pat McGuire here is going to get crushed at a few intervals by Eric Money because listen, man, if there's anybody that can throw him, it's Money.
Eric can throw shade.
Dude, he throws. I built this.
No doubt.
We finished this basement. We built this war department together. That man can throw shade.
He can indeed.
Listen, I'm very good at measuring and doing things, and Eric made me feel like a child a few times. You just turn around and be like, "You ever used a tape measure before?" And I'm like, "God, that hurts. That cuts you deep." You see this beard? I'm a man, of course. But like I've said, my voice goes up like 8 octaves. Like, what's happening? Yeah, I know how to use a tape measure. And I cry. It was ridiculous.
He's just going to have you hold the flashlight.
Dude,
and then yell
by
at him
the
for you.
end of building the basement, I felt 100% like I was holding the flashlight. It's like, because at that point we were doing electrical, and I definitely was. I don't know shit about electrical, but anyway, Eric Money's coming up, and then after that, guys, we're just gonna have you tune in because my brain is racked, as Matt and I mentioned a million times. The gates, the furnace of hell has descended upon Maryland. And so I'm fried. I don't remember. But we have a ton of stuff. Halloween special. Not going to tease it yet, but we got one coming up this year that's a little different than last year, but
it's going to be good.
It's good. And it might be grody for those of you out there, but it's a big story.
For our true crime fans.
That's right. It's for your truies, for your true crime fans out there. So lots and lots and lots coming up. But for now, we hope you have enjoyed this amazing conversation on the memory of the Battle of Gettysburg with Scott Hartwig, who will be back at some point to talk about his upcoming book, I Dread the Thought of the Place.
Yeah.
Which finally, after 1,000 years, follows up to Antietam Creek. God, is this where I get to call him an amateur? Psych.
Oh.
No, I'm kidding. No, I think my favorite part of my experience with him was his absolute honesty when I asked him about taking so long to write a follow-up, how much his voice changed as a writer, and like resisting the urge to rewrite and rewrite. It was very insightful and refreshing, and I throw absolute kidding shade. That man is not an amateur. You've never met a more professional person than Scott Hartwig. So at some point, you're going to hear another conversation with him, but as always, guys, we're off the rails, and that's how we like to do things here at the History of Things podcast. So buckle up. The August offensive is underway. Matt and I got a lot more coming at you, and we hope you stick around. Looking for ways to help the show, 5-star ratings, leaving reviews on your favorite podcast app, and sharing it with a friend. Somebody who doesn't know, get them hip. For our guest today, Scott Hartwig, the legendary Civil War historian. For my co-host with the most, Matt Borders, I am Pat McGuire saying this has been the History of Things podcast. We'll catch you all later.
Have a good night.
Podcast for all the latest news and exclusives. Make sure to also follow Pat and Matt on their social medias at History Things with Pat and at Matt Borders Books. Have a question, comment, or compliment for the show? Send us an email at historythingspodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed the show.